The wagon wheel cracked clean in two on the rock ledge outside Sutter's Bend, and Clara Hollis knew she was stranded. She climbed down from the seat and stood in the red dust of the Wyoming road, staring at the splintered spoke and the listing rear axle. The nearest town was 11 miles behind her. The nearest anything ahead was a question she could not answer. She had 40 cents, a carpet bag, and a letter of employment from a dress shop in Helena that might not even exist anymore. The July sun bore down without mercy. Clara shaded her eyes and looked across the scrubland toward a line of cottonwoods that suggested water, and beyond them, the low roofline of a ranch house with smoke threading from its chimney. She started walking. The yard she entered 20 minutes later was not welcoming. A fence post leaned at a broken angle. Tools lay scattered near a barn door that hung from one hinge. A chicken coop sat empty, its wire torn open. Weeds choked the path to the porch. Everything about the place spoke of a man who had stopped caring for the things around him. A small face appeared in the window of the ranch house. Then it vanished. Clara knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. The door opened 3 inches, and a girl of about 7 stared up at her, with enormous dark eyes set in a pale, unwashed face. "Is your father home?" Clara asked. The girl said nothing. Behind her, a smaller child, a boy, maybe 4, sat on the floor, clutching a ragged blanket, his thumb in his mouth. The house smelled of cold grease and dust. "My wagon broke on the road," Clara said gently. "I just need some water, if you have it." The girl studied her for a long, serious moment. Then she opened the door wider and pointed toward a pump in the kitchen. Clara stepped inside and saw what the children were living in. Dishes piled in a basin, crusted and stinking. A pot of something burned black on the cold stove. Clothes heaped on chairs. A woman's dress hung on a peg near the door, untouched and perfectly pressed, like a ghost standing watch. The floor had not been swept in weeks, and cobwebs laced the window corners. She pumped water into a tin cup and drank. Then she looked at the girl, whose dress was buttoned wrong, and at the boy, whose face was streaked with something sticky, and something in Clara's chest pulled tight. A nod of recognition, of knowing what it looked like when children had been left to fend for themselves. "When did you last eat?" she asked. The girl shrugged. Clara set down the cup. She rolled up her sleeves. She had eggs scrambled and biscuits browning in the oven by the time the front door banged open and a man filled the frame. He was tall, raw-boned, unshaven, with the kind of hard-set jaw that came from clenching it against everything the world had thrown at him. His boots were caked with mud, and his shirt was dark with sweat. His eyes swept the room, the children eating at the table, the strange woman at his stove, and they went from confusion to fury in a single beat. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing in my house?" "Feeding your children," Clara said. She did not flinch. They were hungry. Josiah Cade stared at her, like she had spoken a foreign language. His daughter Bess watched him from the table with biscuit crumbs on her chin, and something in her expression that he had not seen in months. Calm. "Get out," he said. "I will," Clara replied evenly, "as soon as you tell me where the nearest town is, and whether anyone there can fix a wagon wheel." He told her. Harlan's Fork, 7 miles northwest, and old Polk might fix the wheel if he was sober. But his eyes kept drifting back to his children, to the food on their plates, to the color returning to his daughter's cheeks, and Clara saw the war in him, the fury fighting against something that looked dangerously close to relief. He stood in his own doorway and watched her wash the dishes she had dirtied, wipe down the table, and button his daughter's dress correctly before she picked up her carpet bag. "Thank you for the water," she said. She was 10 steps from the porch when Bess ran out after her. "Papa," the girl said, turning back to her father. It was the first word Clara had heard her speak. "Papa, make her stay." Josiah Cade looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the woman standing in his yard, with red dust on her hem, and steady eyes that did not beg, did not plead, did not ask for anything at all. "The bunkhouse is empty," he said roughly. "You can sleep there tonight. I will take you to town in the morning." Morning came, and he did not take her to town. There were reasons. The mare had thrown a shoe, the boy Tommy had a fever, The fence in the north pasture needed mending before the cattle wandered. Clara did not push. She made breakfast. She braided Bess's hair with careful fingers, the girl sitting stone still on the kitchen chair, her eyes closed, her small body leaning back into the touch, like a plant turning toward light. She held Tommy on her lap and sang to him until his fever broke. An old hymn her mother had sung to her in the drafty house in Ohio, where she had grown up plain and overlooked, and entirely certain that no one would ever need her. 3 days became a week. The ranch began to shift under her hands, not in grand ways, in small ones that accumulated like snowfall. The kitchen smelled of bread instead of burned grease. The children's clothes appeared on the line, washed and mended. The chicken coop wire was patched tight enough to bring hens back from the neighbor's place 2 miles down the road, and Bess carried the eggs in every morning with a careful seriousness that made Clara's heart ache with tenderness. On the 5th evening, Tommy brought her a firefly cupped in his small hands, held it out like an offering, and when it blinked its cold green light between his fingers, he looked up at her and almost smiled. She helped him set it free, and he sat down beside her on the porch steps, close enough that his shoulder touched her arm. Josiah watched her from the edges of his own life. He watched her teach Bess to count using pebbles from the creek. He watched her mend the fence rails with a determination that bordered on stubbornness. He watched his son, his silent, grief-shattered son, who had not spoken a full sentence since the day they buried his mother, follow this woman around the yard, like a duckling trailing after the only warm thing in a cold world. He did not want her here. She was a disruption. She was a reminder of everything he had failed to hold together after Margaret died. Every competent thing Clara Hollis did was a mirror showing him his own wreckage, and he resented it with a bitterness that sat in his throat like ash. On the 8th day, he found her in the barn, trying to lift a hay bale that weighed nearly as much as she did. He took it from her hands without a word, swung it onto the stack, and turned to leave. "You could say thank you," she said to his back. "Or you could say, Clara, I appreciate that you have kept my children fed and clean for a week, while I pretended you did not exist. Either would do." He stopped walking. His shoulders were rigid. "I did not ask you to stay," he said. "No, your daughter did." He turned around. The barn was dim, striped with light through the slat walls, and in that broken light she looked. He pushed the thought away. He pushed it hard. "My wife died 7 months ago," he said. The words came out scraped raw. "Fever took her in 3 days. Tommy stopped talking. Bess stopped eating. I have held this place together with my bare hands, and it is still falling apart. And I do not need some woman wandering in off the road to show me what I already know." Clara met his gaze without wavering. "What do you already know?" "That I am not enough." The words hung in the dusty air between them. He had never said them aloud. He had barely admitted them to himself. In the dark hours after midnight, when the children were asleep, and the silence of this house pressed down on him like a stone slab on a grave. Clara stepped closer, not touching him, just close enough that he could see the steadiness in her gray eyes was not coldness. It was strength that had been tested and had held. "You are enough to keep going," she said quietly. "That is more than most men manage." He looked away. His jaw worked. He walked out of the barn, and she let him go. That evening, she found a wooden horse on the bunkhouse step. It was small and rough-carved, the kind of thing a man might whittle on long winter nights when sleep would not come. There was no note. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, feeling the places where the knife had hesitated and then committed to the cut, and she set it on the windowsill beside her bed, where she could see it in the morning light. Clara woke in the bunkhouse to the sound of wind tearing at the roof and rain hammering the walls like fists. She pulled on her boots and ran for the main house, thinking of the children, thinking of the loose shutter on the west wall she had meant to fix and had not. She found Bess and Tommy huddled together in their bed, the little boy screaming, the girl holding him with white-knuckled hands, and a face that was trying so hard to be brave, it nearly broke Clara's heart. She gathered them both into her arms and rocked them while the storm shrieked outside, humming the hymn until Tommy's screaming thinned to whimpering, and then to the hiccuping breaths of a child who had cried himself almost to sleep. Josiah was not in the house. Through the rain-lashed window, she saw lantern lights swinging near the barn. And she knew. The cattle. The creek that ran along the north pasture flooded in heavy rains, and the fence there was still half mended. She got the children settled, wrapped in blankets on the floor by the stove where it was warmest. Bess clung to her hand. "I will come back," Clara told her. "I promise." She ran into the storm. The rain hit her face like thrown gravel. The yard was a sea of mud, and the wind bent the cottonwoods nearly sideways. She could barely see the lantern light anymore, just a faint yellow smear against the black wall of rain. She found him at the creek, waist-deep in black water that churned with mud and debris, hauling a calf up the bank, while the current tried to drag them both under. The fence had given way. 3 cows stood on the far bank, bawling into the wind. The calf was terrified, thrashing, and Josiah's grip was slipping on the wet hide. Clara waded in without hesitation. The cold hit her like a wall. She grabbed the calf's head, held it above the water, and together they hauled the animal onto solid ground. The current knocked her sideways, and Josiah caught her arm. Caught her hard, pulled her against him, held her there while the water roared past their legs. For a moment they stood in the rain and the dark, breathing hard, his hand gripping her arm, her hand gripping his shirt, and the distance he had kept between them collapsed like a fence in a flood. He pulled her up the bank, his arm around her waist. They got the calf to shelter. They did not speak, but when they reached the porch of the house, soaked and shaking, he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough and unsteady. "Clara, thank you." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she had kept locked and quiet for a very long time. Inside, they found Tommy asleep in Bess's arms, and Bess asleep sitting up, still holding her brother. Clara knelt and eased them both down onto the blankets, tucking the covers around their small bodies with the tenderness of someone handling something irreplaceable. Josiah stood behind her and watched, and something in his face cracked open. Not broke, not shattered, but opened, like a door that had been sealed shut against the cold, finally letting the warmth in. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the world was washed clean and bright. Clara made coffee and set it in front of him at the table. He wrapped his hands around the cup and stared into it. "Poke can fix your wagon wheel," he said. "I will ride to town today and bring him back." Clara nodded. She wiped her hands on her apron, Margaret's apron, which Bess had taken from the peg and offered to her silently on her 3rd morning, and which Clara had accepted with the gravity of a woman receiving a sacrament. "That would be fine," she said. He did not move. The coffee steamed between his hands. The clock ticked in the silence. "Or," he said, and stopped. From the hallway, the sound of small footsteps. Bess appeared in the kitchen doorway, Tommy behind her, his hand wrapped in his sister's. The little boy looked at Clara and then at his father, and Bess knelt down and whispered something in her brother's ear. Tommy let go of his sister's hand. He crossed the kitchen floor on bare feet. He reached Clara and lifted his arms, and when she picked him up, he pressed his face into her neck and said the first full sentence he had spoken in 7 months. "Do not go away." Clara closed her eyes. She held the boy against her and felt his small heart beating through his ribs, fast and frightened and alive, and the locked-up place inside her chest broke open like ice on a spring river. She looked at Josiah over the boy's head. His face had come undone. The jaw that had been clenched for 7 months was trembling. His eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. Bess crossed the kitchen and took her father's hand. She looked up at him with Margaret's dark eyes, and she whispered the word that the title of this family's next chapter would be written around. "Stay," she said. "Papa, tell her to stay." Josiah Cade had buried his wife in the hard ground behind the barn. He had held his children while they screamed for a mother who was not coming back. He had mended fence and hauled water and fed cattle through the worst winter of his life. And he had not wept once through any of it, because he was afraid that if he started, he would not stop. He wept now, standing in his kitchen, in the morning light, with his daughter's hand in his, and his son in a stranger's arms. The tears came, and he let them. They were not the tears of a man falling apart. They were the tears of a man who had been holding himself together so tightly that the act of letting go felt like the bravest thing he had ever done. "Please," he said. His voice broke on the word. "Clara, please stay." She stood there with his son on her hip, in his dead wife's apron, in the kitchen she had scrubbed clean, in the life she had walked into by accident and could not bring herself to walk out of, and she gave him the only answer that had ever been true. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. He did not kiss her. He was not ready for that, and she knew it, and she did not need it. He put his arms around her, and the boy between them, and Bess pressed herself against their legs, and for the first time since Margaret's death, the 4 of them stood together like something whole. Outside, the cottonwoods dripped with last night's rain, and the creek had settled back into its banks. Clara's broken wagon sat on the road where she had left it 10 days ago, its cracked wheels sinking into the mud. She would never fix it. She would never need to. She had arrived in Sutter's Bend with 40 cents and a letter to a dress shop in Helena. She would stay with something worth more than all the dress shops in Montana, a family that needed her, a man learning to let himself be saved, and 2 children who had taught her that home was not a place you traveled to, but a place that found you when you were brave enough to stop running. Josiah wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and the faintest, most hard-won ghost of a smile. "I will make more coffee," he said. "I will drink it," she answered. And that was how it began.